Listen very carefully and follow my instructions. Prepare your brain for the Cortex Labs Nootropics podcast.
I gotta tell you, being an entrepreneur, I will not go through the rest of my career without taking nootropics. Aniracetam, piracetam, modafinil, Noopept, uridyl monophosphate. I mean, phenylpiracetam, forget it. You can always have a better brain.
The Cortex Labs Nootropics podcast is about to begin.
Episode number 54 of the Cortex Labs Nootropics podcast. I am your host, Ryan Michael Ballo. We're going to talk about whether the brain-derived neurotrophic factor and the nerve growth factor facilitating nootropic compounds induce some sort of long-term residual memory, positive memory effects for people. I'm going to kind of give my anecdotal experience. I'm not sure that question can be answered from as far as what we know. We could just sort of look at what we know about brain-derived neurotrophic factor and nerve growth factor. These are things that basically upregulate neurogenesis and engage in repair on neurons, but also work particularly in the hippocampus, which is a memory-centric region of the brain. We can just sort of look at how this stuff is working in conjunction with nootropics and kind of just draw theoretical conclusions from there. And then we can really kind of just go off our anecdotal stuff. I've been taking nootropics for just about 9 years. There was a phase where I took a lot of heavy Noopept. And in that phase, that literally was the transformation for me from going to basically being pretty terrible at reading comprehension. We've talked about this many times on the Cortex Labs YouTube channel, a lot of our blog posts, some of our podcasts, to being someone who can read 10 to 20 to 30 to 40 page studies. In fact, I remember reading this was like a 200 or 300 page PDF on something back in the day. It was a hobby of mine that I was studying and had to do with like the FBI and an investigation they did. I basically read an entire FBI investigation, all the paperwork, associated paperwork on some topic. And I was doing it for a hobby and an interesting thing I was into at the time. And look, it took me a while to read it, but after I read it all, which I did, I read all of it. I read the entire, it was like 200 page PDF. I remembered virtually everything. I mean, and to this day, like I remember a lot of what happened, what was going on in that investigation. And I never, ever would have been able to do that without nootropics. Just to give you an idea, I failed, I think I barely passed pre-algebra. Then I failed Algebra 1 twice. I just could not remember, anything. I was always a good reader, but I was terrible at reading comprehension. So you can put anything in front of me and I'll read it and it's fine. Like what are the complex words or simple words? Didn't really matter. My vocabulary has always been relatively vast because I make a conscious effort to always improve the quantity of words I have usable and ready in the reservoir. But I've just been very terrible at recall, essentially comprehension, just like reading a bunch of things and remembering what I'm reading. It's never clicked for me until I started taking nootropics. So we'll talk about Noopept particularly here in a bit. I just want to do a minute and a half of sponsors before we get into the bulk of this podcast. Our sponsors are us because we are a nootropics company. Hey, right now, if you're listening to this on, I think it's the 7th of January, 2018. Yeah, 7th of January, 2018. 20% off everything at the Cortex Labs website. That's the Cortex stack, our powerful pre-made stack. If you want to try a stack that really turns the lights on, gets your brain in gear, in a go mode, focus, motivation, verbal fluency, speed of processing, mental energy, get a bottle of Cortex. Right now, it's $27. Okay, we wrote 5 digital guides. One, the Noopept Pro Stack List. That's a giant expert digital guide and a list of Noopept stacks that turn on specific brain states. We've got stacks for focus, mental energy, stacks for speed of processing, stacks for everything in that digital guide. It's digital, so you can download it on any device you have and start reading it. Then we've got Smarter, Better, Faster. That's a digital guide that teaches you everything. If you're new to nootropics, just get Smarter, Better, Faster. All right, just get that digital guide, teaches you everything, has many stacks in it. Then we got the Racetam God Guide, a little more expert. It has stacks on every major Racetam, how to use them. You got the nootropic stacks for the business professional. That's about 100 stacks total that are targeted for business productivity. And then recently we launched the beginner's guide to aniracetam. 25 aniracetam stacks, how to cycle aniracetam, what to cycle when you cycle off aniracetam, what aniracetam stacks with, everything you can think of in those digital guides. Get them at livecortex.com. And then lastly, we do 2 consulting services. One on nootropics. It's a 40-minute call with me, 15 additional email correspondences. Get it at livecortex.com. And then we recently just started doing chronic fatigue syndrome consults. that's something I was afflicted by in the past. It took me years to get over it. I figured out what was wrong in my body, how to fix it, largely hint, related to the gut and related to detox pathways. It is fixable in my experience, and so we do a consult on chronic fatigue syndrome. Get all that stuff at livecortex.com. Okay, so what we know about Noopept particularly, let's just take Noopept as an example, is that, at least looking at rat studies, is that it stimulates the expression of nerve growth factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor in particular regions of the brain, and specifically the rat hippocampus. We think that this happens in humans. It isn't implausible to think that could happen. The thing about nerve growth factor particularly, and reading directly from Wikipedia, is that it's a neurotrophic factor, a neuropeptide primarily involved in the regulation of growth, maintenance, proliferation. I think proliferation is probably the most applicable term here in relation to what we're talking about, and survival of certain target neurons. It is perhaps the prototypical growth factor, and that it was one of the first to be described. And nerve growth factor is really interesting. The woman who made it public and sort of discovered it, she's a Nobel laureate. Her name is Rita Levi-Montalcini. She's now dead, but she took it in her eyeballs. She dropped a nerve growth factor in a solution across, into her eyeballs, and the whole idea was she needed it to cross the blood-brain barrier and couldn't do it any other way. She lived to 112, 113 in pristine cognitive form. Whether nerve growth factor played a role is in question. No one knows, but it seems pretty likely. It seems at least plausible. This lady lived to 113 years old, and her cognitive performance was nothing short of incredible. She's given interviews on YouTube at 95, and she's as verbally fluent as the smartest college kid Something's going on there, right? And so let's just take a step back for a second. I was always terrible at reading comprehension. It started to change for me when I started taking Noopept. I started realizing I could read scientific studies and I could read things and understand what I read, and that after I stopped reading it, I could go back to thinking about it and I could remember much of what I read. And it basically just got better and better as time went on. The first time I took Noopept and noticed it, I kind of noticed a strong urge to want to read, and I did. And I was like, this is interesting. I never really had the urge to read because I couldn't remember what I read. I always had, terrible comprehension. But then as time went on, I recognized that whether taking Noopept or not, and this was after a long period of experimentation with Noopept, I could cycle off of Noopept, for example. I could cycle off of basically everything, and I'd still retain memory benefits. So the real question is, and then by the way, throughout my time taking nootropics, I've taken many, many different compounds, ranging from Noopept, of course, to other nerve growth factor facilitating compounds like acetyl L-carnitine and like the mushroom lion's mane. But Noopept was a particularly long time of experimentation. I made a long time experimenting with Noopept, and again, this is when I started noticing that I could remember more things that I read, and that I wanted to sit down and do intellectual stuff, whereas previously I just hated doing it. I hated reading because I know I couldn't comprehend anything. And then it was really thereafter that I noticed, man, my brain really does work in a substantial way around reading comprehension. Here's the interesting thing. These days, I take a lot less Noopept because I've just come to learn how to cycle between very many stacks. So, in a 3-month period, I'm probably taking 60 stacks. These are just different stacks: chloraracetam, triacetyluridine, vinpocetine stacks, aniracetam, oxiracetam, fasiracetam stacks, modafinil, caffeine, theanine stacks, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and acetylcholine stacks, right? Uridine, CDP, choline, Alcar, B vitamin stacks. So it always changes, and that's the way you avoid side effects and tolerance and all these sorts of things. And I cycle off of very many compounds, sometimes everything but coffee and ALA frequently. But the interesting thing about it is, even though these days I take a lot less Noopept than I did when I was experimenting with it, and then I was writing the Noopept Pro Stack List, the digital guide that explains everything on Noopept and gives you stacks, I was experimenting with Noopept in a whole bunch of different stack combinations around that time. After all of that is essentially calmed down and I don't take it all that much, I still retain all of my working memory. So the real question is, how is it now that, after a lot of experimentation with Noopept and therefore looking at the mechanisms, sort of stimulating, at least over baseline, the expression of BDNF in the hippocampus, which is what we know Noopept does in rats, is that responsible for the fact that now I can comprehend what I read? and I don't take Noopept a whole lot like I used to, and it still sticks with me, right? Did I upregulate nerve growth factor and therefore the proliferation of neurons in my hippocampus, and thus a better capacity for me to have working memory, right? And does this validate, if so, the significance of nootropics, at least for some of these things, right? There's many different reasons you take nootropics. Acute performance, I want verbal fluency now, I want mental energy now, I got to work on something for 7 hours, I'm going to take modafinil, whatever. And then there's the long-term thing, right? There's doing stuff like this. There's, putting these compounds in your body and having them go and do what they do, what their mechanisms are, and in this case, stimulate the expression of brain-derived neurotrophic factor and or nerve growth factor in the hippocampus, and therefore potentially creating more neurons, repairing damage that could have been there. I'm going to get, again, this is all theoretical, but, it's not unlikely based on what this stuff does. And could that all be responsible for now how I have better working memory and I can read stuff and actually remember what I want to read? And frankly, these days, I like it. I like reading. I like reading books now. I like getting into deep stuff. I would never have been able to accumulate all the information I have via, about nootropics if I hadn't had my brain working good via taking nootropics. I mean, there's just no question about it. And so I kind of wanted to just do this podcast to serve as an anecdotal, because I see a lot of folks asking questions like this. It's two things. I mean, I think folks are usually trying to take nootropics for short-term gains, and that's good. But a lot of folks sort of skeptically ask, like, well, what are the long-term benefits? Does it really truly make you smarter? Are you only just speeding everything up right now? And the answer is I don't think you're just speeding things up right now. For a lot of these, especially Noopept, especially certain racetams, especially compounds like triacetyluridine and uridine monophosphate. I just don't think, I think that these compounds have long-term implications, and most of them seem to be good so long as you're dosing correctly. My own personal anecdotal experiences, there's no question that I'm substantially better at reading information and comprehending it than I used to be. Nothing has changed since before this was the case, and now it is the case, other than me taking nootropics and particularly Noopept. I mean, it's just pretty clear to me. So, I hope this has been a good anecdotal experience, a good report for folks to look at, particularly in the nerve growth factor and the BDNF range of nootropics. That's one of the things I'm really interested in a lot these days, and over the course of the last few months, I've been experimenting with just taking lion's mane kind of on its own, just a gram of lion's mane, not all days, but some days, just to sort of see what it's doing over time. And I've noticed interesting stuff. I've noticed that I recall a lot more things from when I was a kid. I found myself thinking about stuff I haven't thought about in 15 years, 20 years. And I don't know if I ever would have thought about them again, right? And I can remember it all in a little more clarity than usual. And then, to some degree, it feels like my regular functional working memory might have been slightly improved. I've been taking nootropics for a long time, so it's really hard to tell. But I'm into it. These days, I'm truly into nerve growth factor and brain-derived neurotrophic factor a lot. It's one of the reasons I like taking Alcar, because it's been shown to sort of do the same thing in stimulating nerve growth factor in the rat brain over chronic usage. So that has been the episode number 54 of the Cortex Labs Nootropics podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for being with me. Check us out on the web at livecortex.com, at livecortex.com/blog, at the Cortex Labs YouTube channel, Cortex Labs Nootropics YouTube channel. Lots of cool stuff coming up. We got a product for gut bacteria, basically targeting SIBO coming up. That's in the distant future, but it's something we're working on. We just started a chronic fatigue syndrome consulting service and program for folks that have CFS. I think I can help folks. I helped myself get out of a dark hole of chronic fatigue syndrome that lasted just about 2 years. And we've got a lot more digital guides coming. We got mostly the most significant stuff is we've got a couple new nootropic products coming out. These are pre-made stacks just like Cortex. Cortex is extremely powerful, but we want to diversify and have a bunch of different stacks. We'll have primarily a stack launched sometime in the next couple months, 3-4 months, that is essentially a get into gear stack. It's like if you're in a place where you need to get into gear, okay, and you don't want to drink coffee or do anything else, you just need your brain to turn on within 20 minutes. We'll have a stack for that. We're building it in the next little bit. In the meantime, the Cortex stack, get it at livecortex.com, 20% off right now at $27. All of our digital guides, 20% off right now. Super, super cheap, downloadable and digital, give you many stacks, give you distinctions like this. And thanks so much for being with me. Talk to you next time.